Code Ginger. Part 1, The Gamer. Chapter 1, The Ginger Hypothesis. The red hair was the least interesting thing about Duncan MacRae, and it was also the only thing anyone ever noticed first. He'd been the only ginger head in 3 consecutive years of primary school photographs in Kirkwall, the only one in his cohort at Edinburgh, and now, at 28, the only one in the entire basement corridor of the Consciousness Studies annex at Stanford, a fact his advisor liked to make jokes about at department mixers, in the particular tone of a man who thought himself charming. "MacRae, you're our resident Pict. Explain to Dr. Yamamoto why the Highlands still can't get 4G. Duncan had learned to laugh along. It was easier than explaining that the joke was closer to his actual research than anyone in that room understood. He didn't tell them about the annotation in the back of his copy of Science and Human Transformation, found in a second-hand shop on University Avenue 3 years ago, in a hand that was careful, slightly archaic. Initialed only JAM, he didn't tell them that he'd spent 2 years trying to disprove one particular sentence scrawled in the margin. The antenna is genetic, not neural. The brain is the receiver's processor. DNA is the receiver itself, and had instead spent 2 years accumulating evidence that the sentence might be true. He especially didn't tell them what he suspected about his own hair. Red hair was a red herring, in the most literal sense. The MC1R gene variant explained the pigment, the melanocortin receptor that failed to produce eumelanin and defaulted to the reddish pheomelanin instead. But it didn't explain why Scotland, of all places on Earth, carried the highest concentration of that variant in the human population. 10, sometimes 13%, depending on the parish. Ireland close behind. A tight geographic cluster at the northwestern edge of a continent, as if something had been selected for, hard, in a very specific place, for reasons nobody had ever adequately modeled. Standard population genetics offered the usual hand-waving. Genetic drift, founder effect, possibly some correlation with vitamin D synthesis in low UV climates. Duncan had read every paper. None of them satisfied him, because none of them explained why the same populations also carried an unusually high frequency of a cluster of non-coding repeat sequences, flanking the MC1R locus, sequences with no known protein coding function, no known regulatory function, and a geometry that, when Duncan finally got around to modeling it properly in his second year of the PhD, turned out to match, disturbingly closely, the phased element spacing of a fractal log-periodic antenna. He had not gone looking for this. It had found him, the way most obsessions do, sideways, through a tangent he almost didn't follow. He'd been building a signal processing pipeline to analyze EEG data for his actual, sanctioned dissertation work, something about predictive coding and meditative states. Respectable enough that Dr. Priestley had signed off on it without reading past the abstract, and on a bored Sunday he had, for no defensible reason, run the same Fourier analysis on his own raw whole genome sequencing data. Purchased 2 Christmases ago from a consumer testing company as a novelty gift to himself. The repeat sequences shouldn't have produced a clean spectral signature. Junk DNA was supposed to be junk, evolutionary detritus, retroviral scar tissue, structurally inert. Instead, when Duncan mapped the physical spacing of his most conserved non-coding repeats against known antenna geometries, the log-periodic match came back at a correlation coefficient that made him check his code 4 times for a bug. There wasn't one. The most highly conserved sequences in the human genome, the ones so old they predated the split between modern humans and Neanderthals, were phased like a radio. He had told no one. He had built TUNER instead. TUNER was not, technically, a piece of physics equipment. It was a modified biofeedback rig, a 64-channel EEG cap feeding into a signal processor of Duncan's own design, paired with a copper induction plate that rested against the base of the skull and fed back a very low, very specific extremely low-frequency pulse, tuned, in theory, to the resonant band of his own genome's most conserved repeat cluster. The theory was straightforward, in the way that all genuinely dangerous theories are straightforward. If the repeat sequences functioned as a receiving antenna, and if consciousness itself was not generated by the brain but merely filtered and localized by it, a hypothesis Duncan had encountered first in Penrose's and Hameroff's quantum microtubule work, and had come to find more persuasive with every year of graduate school. Much to Dr. Priestley's despair, then a sufficiently coherent neural state, tuned to the correct resonant frequency, might act as a carrier signal. A key turning in a lock that had, as far as anyone knew, never once in the history of the species been deliberately turned. He built it the way he built everything else that mattered to him, as a game. He had 4,000 hours logged in Aldermere, a sprawling, procedurally generated strategy RPG that let you seed and steer a civilization across centuries of simulated time, watching your choices compound into architecture, myth, and drift. He understood systems. He understood feedback loops, resource curves, the slow accretion of consequence. He approached TUNER the same way as a system to be mapped, one variable at a time, with himself as both operator and only test subject, and absolutely no ethics board on earth that would ever sign off on what he was about to do. He waited until a Friday night in late October, when his flatmate was away and the building had gone quiet, before he tried it properly for the first time. The rig took 40 minutes to calibrate. He sat cross-legged on a foam mat in the center of his small room, curtains drawn, laptop screen dimmed to a red glow so it wouldn't disturb his dark-adapted eyes, and began the breathing protocol he'd adapted from a meditation app and a stack of neuroscience papers on sustained theta-gamma coupling. 4 counts in, 4 counts held, 6 counts out. His EEG trace on the monitor beside him drifted from the jagged spikes of beta into the smoother rolling swell of alpha. And then, slower still, into theta, the state where the conscious, narrating mind goes quiet and something older takes over. He held it 6 minutes 8. The copper plate against his skull began to feel warm, though the readout said its temperature hadn't changed by more than half a degree. At 11 minutes, TUNER's secondary monitor, the one tracking the induction plate's return signal, the channel meant to catch anything coming back, produced its first genuine anomaly. A cluster of harmonic peaks, sharp and structured, rose out of the noise floor exactly where his model predicted his genome's dominant resonant band should sit. Duncan, even in the soft fog of theta, felt something in his chest go very still. It was working, whatever it was. And then the floor tilted. There is no better word for it, and Duncan would spend the following weeks trying to find one and failing. It was not dizziness. It was not a hallucination, not exactly a dream. It was the sensation, precise, mechanical, almost geometric, of his awareness sliding along an axis he had not previously known his mind possessed, the way a marble slides down a groove cut exactly to its diameter. The room did not fade so much as it was superseded, replaced by another set of sensory coordinates entirely, the way one screen replaces another in a transition he was too disoriented to watch happen. He was standing, he had not been standing. He was cold, genuinely cold, in a way his overheated Palo Alto apartment had not been in years, a wet, bone-deep North Sea cold that came with the smell of peat smoke and wet wool and, faintly, fish oil. He was looking down at his hands, except they were not his hands. Broader, thicker through the knuckle, the nails ridged and yellowed, a fine dusting of hair across the back of each finger that caught the low orange light of an oil lamp and burned red gold. Duncan, the passenger, the observer, whatever he now was, tried to lift the hand. Nothing happened. He tried again, focusing every ounce of intention he had into the simple act of curling a finger. The hand did not move because he willed it to. It moved because its owner willed it to, reaching for a length of net line coiled on a low wooden bench, and Duncan went along for the motion the way a passenger goes along for the turn of a car, feeling the shift of weight, the pull of tendon, without possessing any authority over where it went next. I'm not in control, he understood, with a clarity that cut through the disorientation like cold water. I'm not steering, I'm watching from inside. The room resolved slowly, as his borrowed eyes adjusted or as his own comprehension caught up. A low stone croft house, a single room, a peat fire banked in a hearth of unmortared stone. A woman, no, Duncan corrected himself, feeling the host's own attention settle on her with an unmistakable, wordless warmth that was not his own emotion, but that he was nonetheless drenched in, sat mending a net by the same low light. her hair covered by a dark cloth, though a few loose strands had escaped at her temple, and they were red. Not auburn, not strawberry blonde. The same hard, coppery red that stared back at Duncan every morning from his own bathroom mirror. He had no idea what year it was. There was no calendar on the wall, no clock, nothing so convenient as a newspaper. But the tools were wrong for anything within living memory: iron, hand-forged. The netline looked like plaited horsehair rather than any synthetic fiber, and the language murmuring underneath the host's thoughts, when the woman spoke to him without turning from her mending, was not English. It had the shape of English's grandparent, guttural and compressed, and Duncan's borrowed mind understood it perfectly, the way you understand your own native tongue without having to translate it first. "You'll be wanting your supper before the tide," the woman said, or something with that shape and that meaning, and the host, Duncan's ancestor, some number of generations back he had absolutely no way of calculating, grunted something affectionate and indistinct in reply, and Duncan felt, second-hand and unbidden, a wash of pure, uncomplicated contentment. Fire, fish stew, a wife with red hair mending a net. Nothing more complicated than that. And Duncan, sitting cross-legged 11 minutes, and, apparently, several centuries away, felt his own throat tighten with an emotion that had no business being his. He did not try to whisper. He did not try to nudge or steer or announce himself. He had not yet built a theory of how that might even be attempted, and some deeper instinct, the same one that made him keep his hands folded and still on the school bus as a boy. The outsider learning not to draw attention told him that tonight was not the night to test the edges of whatever this was. Tonight was for watching. So he watched. The host ate. The fire burned low. At some point, Duncan couldn't have said when, because time inside the connection did not behave the way TUNER's clock on the outside insisted it should. The host lay down on a straw pallet beside the woman, and the room went dark, and Duncan felt consciousness, his host's, and by extension his own, begin to slide down toward sleep. He panicked. Some animal part of him did not want to find out what happened if he fell asleep inside another man's mind 300 years before his own birth, and the fear itself seemed to work like a lever. He felt the connection judder, thin, fray at the edges like a radio station losing its signal at the boundary of its broadcast range. He came back with a gasp that emptied his lungs entirely, as though he'd been held underwater. The room was his own room. The laptop screen glowed dim red in the dark. The clock in the corner of TUNER's interface read 11:47 p.m. 11 minutes had passed on the readout. 11 minutes, start to finish, exactly matching the theta window he'd sustained before the connection first spiked. Duncan sat very still on the foam mat, copper plate still warm against the base of his skull, and did the only thing his training had ever really prepared him to do in the face of an experience that defied his models. He reached for the keyboard, opened a blank document, and began, with hands that would not entirely stop shaking, to write down everything he could remember before it faded: the smell of the peat smoke, the plaited horsehair line, the shape of the language, the woman's hidden red hair, the wordless, borrowed contentment of a fire and a full stomach and a body that was, unmistakably, unarguably, built along the exact same genetic lines as his own. He did not sleep that night. He did not try to reconnect, either, though the pull to do so was already, quietly, extraordinary. He sat at his desk as the sky over Palo Alto went from black to gray to a thin autumn gold, staring at 11 minutes of biometric data that had somehow contained an entire evening in a life he had no way of dating, no way of verifying, and no earthly way of ever explaining to another living soul. At some point before dawn, he opened his genealogy software, a hobby project from a few years back, when his mother had gone obsessed with a subscription ancestry site and roped him into helping digitize the family tree, and scrolled back through the branches on the Orkney side, the MacRae and Tate and Sinclair lines that thinned out into parish records and then into nothing at all, sometime in the early 1700s. Where the paper trail simply ran out into centuries of illiterate crofters and fishermen who had left no documents behind at all. He didn't know, yet, whether he'd been inside one of them. He didn't know if the woman with the hidden red hair had a name that had survived anywhere, in any record. He didn't know, really, Anything at all except that something in him, something old and quiet and until tonight entirely unsuspected, had reached backward through his own blood and touched something real. He closed the laptop around 6 in the morning, finally, and lay down on top of his bed without undressing, staring at the ceiling, listening to his own heartbeat, and thought, I need to do that again. He did not yet think of it as a game. That would come later, once the fear had worn thin enough to let curiosity back in. Tonight, it was simply the largest thing that had ever happened to him, and he had no one on earth he could tell. Chapter 2, The Sandbox. It took Duncan 9 days to work up the nerve to try again, and when he did, he approached it the way he approached everything that frightened and fascinated him in equal measure. He built a spreadsheet. The spreadsheet had columns for date attempted, theta onset time, connection duration, both objective and subjective, where he could estimate the latter estimated era of the host, geographic indicators, language markers, and a column he labeled, half joking and half in dead earnest, notes on host psychology. He treated it the way he treated his Aldermere saves. A long game, played patiently, with careful documentation, because the alternative was to treat it as what it actually was, which was considerably too large a thing to hold in his mind all at once without his hands starting to shake again. The second connection came easier than the first. He'd refined the coherence protocol, extended his theta window training with an additional week of practice, and the pull, when it came, arrived at 9 minutes instead of 11. As though the pathway itself had been worn slightly smoother by the first passage, the way a path through undergrowth becomes a path through use. This time, he found himself behind the eyes of a boy, 12, perhaps 13, walking along a shingle beach somewhere that Duncan, watching through inherited senses rather than direct sight, guessed by the particular gray-green color of the water and the low black outline of the hills across the sound might be Orkney again, though centuries closer to his own time. The boy's hands, when they came into view gathering driftwood into a canvas sling, were freckled rather than weathered, but the hair, visible when the wind caught the boy's cap and sent it tumbling, was the same unmistakable copper. Duncan did not try to whisper. He was, by his own rules he had written into the spreadsheet in a tab labeled simply Protocol, in the specific, slightly absurd formality of a man drafting his own gameplay constraints, still in what he thought of as observation mode. He wanted data before he touched anything. He wanted to understand the shape of the sandbox before he moved a single piece in it. Over the following 3 weeks, he went back 6 more times. He mapped a scatter of hosts across roughly 200 years of his own bloodline. The boy on the beach, who he eventually placed, through a scrap of half-legible correspondence that turned up when he pressed his mother for old family papers, as a great-great-great-uncle who had drowned at 19 and about whom nobody in the family had spoken in generations. A woman in a tenement, clothes in 19th-century Glasgow doing piecework by gaslight, coughing in a way that made Duncan's own chest ache in sympathy for days afterward. A soldier, stationed somewhere with palm trees that made no sense at all for a Scot until Duncan cross-referenced service records and found a regiment posted to Malaya in the 1940s. Every time the rules held, he was a passenger. He could feel what the host felt: hunger, cold, grief, the particular ache of the soldier's homesickness, sharp enough that Duncan woke from that one with tears already dried on his own face and no memory of having cried them. But he could not move a hand that was not, by any measure that mattered, his hand to move. Sovereignty, he wrote in the spreadsheet, category core mechanic confirmed. Host retains full agency. No possession. I am observer only. It was, he began to admit to himself somewhere around the 5th or 6th session, the single most extraordinary thing a human being had ever been permitted to do. And he was doing it the way he might grind achievements in a video game. Methodically, a little compulsively, filling in columns on a spreadsheet at 4 in the morning with the particular joyless focus of a man who has found something so large he can only approach it by making it small. He told no one, not his mother, not his flatmate, not Dr. Priestley, not the 2 friends from the physics cohort he still occasionally got a pint with on Thursdays. There was, he understood with growing and uncomfortable clarity, no version of this conversation that ended with anyone believing him, and no version of the belief, if by some miracle it were granted, that ended somewhere good. He thought, more than once, of the note in the back of Tiller's book, J.A.M.'s careful, archaic hand, the sentence he hadn't fully absorbed the first time he'd read it. You will be tempted to keep this to yourself. That is correct. Do not seek permission for what you are about to become. He had not yet become anything, he told himself. He was still just watching. That changed, quietly and almost by accident, on the 11th session. The host this time was a woman he would come to think of, in his own private shorthand, as the Weaver. A name he gave her only after the fact, since she never once, in the several sessions he eventually spent with her, offered anything so convenient as a spoken name Duncan could catch and hold on to. She worked a loom in a low, smoke-blackened room that Duncan guessed, from the cut of the wool and the particular hard consonants underlying her thoughts, sat somewhere in the 17th century, on the Scottish side rather than the Orcadian, though he could not have said how he knew that except that he simply knew it, the knowledge arriving the way all the knowledge did in these sessions, not as information told to him, but as certainty absorbed directly from a mind that already possessed it. She was troubled. Duncan felt it the moment the connection stabilized, a low, grinding worry sitting under everything else she did, the way a headache sits under a day's ordinary tasks. Her hands moved the shuttle back and forth across the warp with the automatic competence of decades of practice, but her attention, underneath, was circling something else entirely. A debt, Duncan gathered, owed to a man in the village whose name arrived in his mind trailing an unpleasant residue of fear, and a decision she had not yet made about whether to sell the last of the good wool to cover it, wool that she had set aside. He felt this with sudden, sharp clarity for her daughter's wedding clothes. Duncan watched the shuttle move. He felt the pull of her worry the way he'd felt the soldier's homesickness, second-hand but entirely real, and somewhere in the space of that feeling, unbidden, a thought arrived that he could not afterward swear was entirely his own. The debt is smaller than she thinks. She has miscounted. He did not intend to project it. He would insist on that point to himself, later, turning the moment over and over the way you turn over a strange stone found on a beach, looking for the seam that would tell you how it had actually been made. He had not decided, consciously, to whisper anything. But the thought was there, sitting in the shared space between his awareness and hers, and the Weaver's hands slowed on the shuttle, and her worry, Duncan felt this distinctly. A small mechanical click of something shifting folded itself around the thought and turned it over. Did I miscount? She wondered in the wordless grammar of her own mind, and set down the shuttle, and reached for a small wooden tally board hung by the loom, and began, laboriously, to recount notches that Duncan understood, without being told, represented the debt in question. The connection ended before he saw the result. Session length, TUNERS readout told him afterward, 7 minutes. Duncan sat on the foam mat for a long time afterward, copper plate cooling against his skull, staring at the wall. He had not whispered on purpose, but something had crossed. A thought that was, at minimum, adjacent to his own intention had entered a mind 300 years dead and had been picked up, turned over, and acted on as though it belonged there. He did not that night go looking in the family records for any trace of a debt reduced or a wedding that had or hadn't happened on schedule in some 17th century parish. He told himself, reasonably enough, that there would be no record to find even if he looked. No parish in Scotland kept that kind of ledger, and even if one had, he had no name, no village, nothing but a feeling and a loom and a tally board. He told himself this was, in the end, simply an interesting footnote for the spreadsheet, filed under notes on host psychology, and he went to bed. But the thought stayed with him for days afterward in a way the earlier sessions hadn't. He found himself, at odd moments, waiting for a bus, half listening in a seminar, turning the mechanism over. If a stray, half-formed thought could cross the connection and be absorbed as the host's own intuition, then the crossing was not an accident of his equipment. It was a property of the channel itself. The whisper, he began, privately, to call it that, and to notice the word arriving with a small, guilty thrill, the particular thrill of a gamer discovering an unlisted mechanic, was not something he had built. It had been there the whole time, waiting for him to stop being careful enough to avoid it. He added a new tab to the spreadsheet. He labeled it, after some consideration, simply, Whisper Deliberate Trials. He did not open it again that week. He told himself he was being careful. He told himself he wanted more data on the passive sessions before he complicated the variable. Both of these things were true, and neither of them were the real reason, which he did not admit to himself until much later. That some part of him, watching the weaver's hand pause over the tally board, had felt a satisfaction so sharp and so total that it had frightened him considerably more than the falling sensation of the very first connection ever had. He was a scientist. He was underneath that, and had been since he was 7 years old, with a hand-me-down console and a save file he guarded like scripture, a gamer. And somewhere in the space between those two things, a small, quiet voice, his own, this time, unmistakably his own, had already begun asking a question he wasn't ready to answer. What else could I fix? He closed the laptop. Outside his window, the Palo Alto evening was doing what it always did, mild, forgettable, entirely unremarkable. And Duncan MacRae sat in the dark for a long time, copper plate still warm in his lap, feeling, for the first time since this had started, less like an observer standing outside a locked door than like a man who had just discovered, quite by accident, that the door had never been locked at all. Chapter 3: The Crannog. By the end of November, Duncan had stopped thinking of the sessions as separate events and started thinking of them as a single continuous project, the way a man restoring an old house stops noticing the smell of sawdust because he lives in it now. The spreadsheet had grown to 4 tabs and 140 rows. His theta onset time had dropped from 11 minutes to 4. He had learned to hold a connection for as long as 31 minutes objective, nearly 2 hours subjective, by his best estimate, before his own body's need to move, or eat, or simply exist as itself again, dragged him back across the gap. He had also learned something else, something he hadn't put in the spreadsheet because he didn't yet have a category for it. He was getting better at being a passenger. It wasn't control. He was careful with that word, in his own head, the way a man on a diet is careful about the word just one. He could not move a host's hand. He had tested that boundary a dozen times since the weaver, always by accident, always with the same result: a wall, soft but absolute, at the exact place where intention would have to become motion. What he could do, he'd discovered, was ride closer to the surface. In the early sessions, he'd been dragged along behind a host's attention like a kite on a long string, seeing only what they happened to look at, feeling only what they happened to feel, with no more agency over the experience than a man watching found footage. Now, with practice, he could lean toward a detail. He could not make a host turn his head, but he could feel out the edges of a host's own half-formed curiosity and, very gently, add his weight to one side of it. The way you might lean on a canoe without capsizing it, shifting the balance point by an inch, and let the person holding the paddle believe the turn was entirely their own idea. He did not call this whispering yet, in his own private ledger. He called it drafting, riding in someone else's wake closely enough to feel the pull of where they might go next, and nudging, very slightly, toward it. It felt less like intervention than like asking a very polite, very silent question, and hoping the host's own mind supplied the answer they were already halfway toward giving anyway. He used this new skill, on the second Thursday of December, to go further back than he had yet dared. He had not planned it. He'd meant that night to revisit the soldier in Malaya. There was a scrap of the man's homesickness Duncan wanted to sit with again, some unfinished business of grief he didn't examine too closely in himself. But the theta state, once he sank into it, did not settle where he pointed it. It slid past the recent, well-worn grooves of the last 2 centuries the way a stylus skips a scratched groove, and kept going, down through decades he hadn't yet mapped, down through a silence in the signal that felt. He would think about this word for days afterward, older. The tilt, when it came, was different. Slower. Deeper, in a way that had nothing to do with subjective time and everything to do with some quality of the connection itself, as if he were not sliding sideways this time, but genuinely descending, the way a diver feels the water change temperature and pressure at different depths of the same sea. He surfaced into cold and water, and the smell of wet alder wood. His host, a young man, Duncan understood this immediately and completely, the knowledge arriving the way it always arrived, wordless and total, was crouched at the edge of a lock in the gray hour before full light, testing the give of a timber post with the flat of his palm. Behind him, rising out of the still black water on a raft of driven piles and packed brushwood, stood a roundhouse. Not on the shore. On the water itself, a low conical structure of timber and thatch, built on an artificial island of stakes and stone that Duncan, even disoriented and borrowed and cold, recognized with a jolt of pure academic delight. A crannog. He'd read about these. Everyone who'd grown up within 100 miles of a Scottish loch had read about these, in the offhand way you absorb the folklore of your own landscape. Man-made islands, ringed with driven piles, built up out of stone and brushwood and timber platforms, some of them occupied and rebuilt and reoccupied for 1,000 years or more, right through from the Bronze Age into the medieval period. He had never expected to be crouched inside one, in someone else's body, at the actual moment of its construction. The host's name arrived in fragments, the way names always did, not as a word Duncan could pronounce, but as a shape of address, the particular cadence with which the other men on the shore called to him. Something close to Cathal, though the vowel wouldn't sit still under Duncan's translation. He was younger than Duncan, maybe 17 or 18, and his hands, when Duncan settled into the borrowed sensation of them, were rope-calloused and split at 2 knuckles. And his hair, when the wind off the loch lifted it, was the same hard copper that had followed Duncan through every session so far, the unbroken thread of it running back through the soldier, and the weaver, and Ewan, and the fisherman, and the boy on the beach. All the way to this cold morning, at the edge of a loch that Duncan could not yet name a year for. He drafted carefully. He let his own curiosity lean, just slightly, against the grain of Cathal's attention, and felt, with the small, guilty thrill he was coming to recognize as the actual engine of this entire project. Cathal's gaze lift, apparently of his own accord, from the timber post to the loch itself, to the low autumn mist sitting on the water, to the dark line of hills on the far shore where the light hadn't yet reached. How long have we been building this? Duncan wondered, and felt the question arrive in Cathal's mind dressed as memory rather than curiosity. Because that was how the crossing worked, he understood by now. There was no channel for questions, only for the answers a host already possessed. Cathal did not wonder. Cathal simply knew, in the effortless way you know your own age, 3 summers. 3 summers of driving piles into the loch bed at the end of each harvest, packing brushwood and stone between them, laying the birch platform, building it up a little more each year against the day his father's household would need to move the whole settlement off the shore entirely. Because of the raiders, Duncan understood. A low current of watchfulness running under everything Cathal did that morning, a wariness about who might come along the loch road from the east. Duncan drafted again, gentler this time, toward the post itself, the specific length of oak Cathal knelt beside, testing its set in the lake bed with the flat of his palm. He felt Cathal's own attention answer the pull, unprompted, the way water finds the lowest point in a field. Cathal leaned close to the post, and Duncan felt the small shock of recognition ripple through his own borrowed nerves, struck it once with the heel of his hand, and listened. Not for a creak, not for a sound of weakness. Cathal was listening for a tone, a low resonant note that traveled up through the timber and into his palm and told him, in a language his hands understood better than his ears did, whether the pile had found true purchase in the clay below the loch mud or whether it still rode loose on silt that would shift and rot the platform within a decade. He struck it again, softer, and adjusted his stance, and struck a 3rd time, and this time the tone that answered, Duncan felt Cathal's shoulders settle, felt the specific, wordless satisfaction of a craftsman's judgment being confirmed, was lower, fuller, the sound of a post that had finally found stone. It was such a small thing. Duncan, watching from inside a mind 3,000 years or more removed from his own, understood with sudden and total clarity that he had just watched a 19-year-old boy do something that Duncan's entire discipline would have called superstition if you described it to them in a seminar room. He listened to the wood, and the wood told him the truth about the ground beneath the water. It wasn't science, not the way Duncan had been trained to use the word. It was something older than that, and more direct, a body that had learned, through some inheritance Duncan couldn't yet name, to read the resonant honesty of struck material the way Duncan himself had spent 2 years learning to read a spectrogram. "Where did you learn that?" Duncan wondered, letting the question sit as close to the surface of Cathal's mind as he dared, and felt, in answer, not a memory of instruction, but something closer to an ache, the specific, wordless grief of an absent father, and underneath the grief, a stubborn certainty that the listening itself had come from further back than any living man could account for, passed down hand to hand through more grandfathers than anyone kept count of. So old that no one in Cathal's household would have dreamed of asking where it began, any more than Cathal would have dreamed of asking why fire burned upward instead of down. Duncan filed the sensation away with a strange, cold thrill he recognized, distantly, uncomfortably, as the same thrill he'd felt discovering the antenna geometry in his own junk DNA, a pattern that goes back further than anyone bothered to ask. The light came up slowly over the far hills, and with it, mercifully, some warmth. Cathal worked through the morning, Duncan rode along, drafting nothing now, simply absorbing, the way he'd learned to during his best sessions, letting the borrowed body's rhythm of labor become a kind of meditation of its own. And it was near midday, as Cathal broke to eat a heel of oat bred on the shore with 2 older men Duncan understood to be uncles, that Duncan got the piece of information he would spend the following week cross-referencing against every astronomical database he could access. One of the uncles, a broad, weathered man with the family's unmistakable hair gone mostly gray, pointed east, toward the pale daylight sky, and said something that made Cathal laugh, low and easy, and shake his head. Duncan caught the shape of it through Cathal's own half-attention. The uncle was talking about the star with a tail that had hung in the eastern sky for 3 nights running before dawn, low and strange, and bright enough to be seen even against the gray Scottish light, and had vanished again on the 4th night as suddenly as it came. The old men had opinions about what it meant. Cathal, Duncan understood with a small flare of fondness for a boy he would never meet in any way that mattered, thought his uncles were being superstitious old fools, and said so, which was why they'd laughed. Duncan held onto the memory of that star the way a drowning man holds onto driftwood. He came back that evening, 34 minutes objective, the longest connection he'd sustained yet, and sat at his desk without turning on the lights, and pulled up every catalog of historically recorded comets he could find. It took him 4 days of increasingly obsessive cross-referencing, running down Chinese astronomical records annotated by a small, devoted community of amateur historians on a forum he'd never had reason to visit before he found it. A comet recorded in the Hancourt Annals as appearing briefly in the eastern pre-dawn sky in what Western reckoning placed at 104 BC, with a second, less certain observation the following year that several of the forum's contributors argued belonged to the same apparition, its tail visible for a handful of nights before it faded from naked eye visibility. 103 BC. Duncan sat back from his laptop and let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He had no way to prove it, no way to walk the artificial island Cathal had been building and carbon date the piles himself, no way to cross-check against a single written record, because there were no written records, not here, not yet, not for centuries. But the comet gave him an anchor no Cranach typology or radiocarbon range from a museum paper ever could. He hadn't just witnessed a plausible reconstruction of Iron Age Scotland. He had a year. A specific, defensible, cross-referenced year, arrived at through nothing more than a boy's uncle pointing at the sky and an amateur astronomy forum on the other side of the planet. He added it to the spreadsheet, Session 14, host, Cathal approx. Location, Cranach construction, unidentified loch, likely Perthshire or Argyll region based on described terrain. Date, 103 BC, cross-referenced via Han Dynasty comet record. He stared at the cell for a long time after he'd typed it. Then, underneath it, in the notes column, he typed something else, more slowly. Host used tonal resonant testing to judge structural integrity of foundation piles, striking timber and reading pitch to determine ground purchase. Not taught in any formal sense, he was aware of described as always known, inherited beyond memory. Query: how far back does this technique actually go? He looked at that last line for a long time. It was, he would understand only much later, the exact moment the project stopped being a game he was documenting and became a question he could not put down. Not the comet, not the crannog, not even the unbroken red thread of hair running back through every host he'd touched, though that alone would have been enough to keep any scientist awake at night. It was the listening. The wood answering the struck palm with a truth older than language, inherited by a boy who had never once thought to ask where it came from. Because in his world, some knowledge simply was, the way the sea simply was, older than any question you could think to ask of it. Duncan MacRae sat at his desk in Palo Alto with the comet's borrowed light still somewhere behind his eyes, and understood, with the particular vertigo of a man watching the floor of his own certainty give way beneath him, that 99 sessions from now, or 900, the thread was not going to end at any crannog. It went back further than Cathal's uncles had words for. It went back further, he suspected, and here the thought arrived with a chill that had nothing to do with the lock water still cold in his borrowed memory than language itself had words for. He closed the spreadsheet, he did not sleep. And somewhere under the 4,000 hours of Aldermere-saved games, under the careful spreadsheet columns, under the whole patient architecture of a man who documented his way through fear, a much older and much less careful question had begun, very quietly, to make itself at home. How far back can I go? Part 2, The Golden Age. Chapter 4, The Depth of Time. The discrepancy first announced itself as an annoyance, not a discovery. Duncan had begun timing his sessions more rigorously in December, less out of scientific rigor than out of a practical need to stop missing his 9 a.m. seminar. He would set TUNER's session clock running the instant he dropped into theta, and he would set a second, ordinary kitchen timer for 45 minutes as a hard ceiling, a promise to himself that he would surface no matter what, whether he wanted to or not. The kitchen timer had gone off exactly as expected every time, a small tinny alarm dragging him up out of some borrowed century by the scruff of the neck. What didn't add up was the inside. He had learned, over the autumn, to hold a rough internal count during his sessions, not a stopwatch, nothing so crude, but a kind of proprioceptive bookkeeping, tracking sunrises, meals, the turning of a host's labor from one task to the next, the way you track the passage of a long film without checking your watch. By his own reckoning, the crannog session with Cathal had covered something close to 6 hours of a young man's life, dawn to well past midday, a full morning's work, and the long, unhurried meal that followed it. TUNER's clock said 34 minutes. He had noticed the mismatch at the time and filed it, the way he filed most anomalies that autumn, under a heading in his own head reserved for things I will think about properly later, once I've confirmed I'm not imagining this whole enterprise. But the ratio kept recurring, and it kept getting worse the further back he reached. And by the second week of January, Duncan MacRae, theoretical physicist, 4,000 hours deep into a strategy game about civilizations he now suspected he understood rather better than his colleagues gave him credit for, could no longer file it away as noise. He built a proper protocol to test it. He picked 6 target depths, evenly spaced across roughly 1,000 years of his own lineage, and for each one he chose sessions where the host was engaged in an activity with an externally verifiable duration. A journey the host himself understood to take a fixed number of days. A tide cycle, the burning down of a particular length of candle, a host happened to be watching, once, memorably, an entire harvest from first light to the hauling in of the last cart. He logged the subjective duration as best he could estimate it against the host's own sense of time passing, and he logged TUNER's objective clock alongside it. And at the end of 3 weeks, he sat at his kitchen table with the numbers laid out in a grid, and felt the particular vertigo of a man watching a straight-line refuse, stubbornly, to be straight. Near the surface, sessions within 2 or 3 centuries of his own birth, the ratio held close to something almost sane. An hour of subjective time cost him something like 8 or 9 objective minutes. Strange, certainly. Nothing about any of this belonged in a universe he'd been trained to believe in, but it was linear adjacent, a distortion he could imagine eventually modeling, given time and better instruments. Then he pushed past 1,000 years, and the line broke. At roughly 800 BCE, a session with a host tending goats on a hillside Duncan still hadn't managed to place the sky wrong. The constellations subtly rotated from what he expected. 6 subjective hours had cost him 4 objective minutes. He checked the math 3 times before he trusted it. 40 seconds of clock time, sitting cross-legged on his own floor with a copper plate cooling against his skull, for every subjective hour lived inside a stranger 3,000 years dead. He thought immediately, instinctively, of redshift. Of light stretching as it climbed out of a gravity well, frequency dropping, wavelength lengthening. The signal from a distant source arriving changed by the sheer distance it had crossed to reach you. He had no defensible reason to believe the analogy held. Nothing in his admittedly amateur model of the antenna predicted anything resembling relativistic time dilation. But the shape of the distortion nagged at him with the specific, itchy familiarity of a metaphor that fit too well to be entirely wrong. Depth in time in this system did not behave like depth in space. It behaved like depth in a field. The further the signal had to reach, the more the connection itself seemed to compress the 2 clocks against each other. Subjective richness ballooning outward even as objective cost collapsed toward nothing. He sat with that for a long time, in the particular stillness of his kitchen at 2 a.m., tea gone cold at his elbow, and understood, not with excitement, not yet, but with something closer to the flat, cold clarity of a man recalculating the size of a room he'd thought he understood. That the deeper he was willing to go, the less any of this would cost him in the only currency that mattered to his actual, physical, 31-year-old body sitting on a floor in Palo Alto. He didn't trust the number. He ran the protocol again, twice, with fresh targets, tightening his estimate of subjective duration each time by cross-checking against verifiable external details. A lunar phase a host happened to remark on, a market cycle, once a birth he could count forward 9 months from a described conception. The ratio held. If anything, it steepened. Weeks, he thought, staring at the extrapolated curve on his laptop screen, feeling the number arrive with the specific, quiet dread of a diver checking a depth gauge, and realizing he has already gone further than his air supply should allow. I could live weeks down there and come back before my tea went cold. He closed the laptop. He did not touch TUNER again for 4 days, the longest gap since he'd started, not out of fear exactly, though fear was certainly present, but out of the same instinct that had once made him stop 3 levels from a boss fight in a game he wasn't ready for, some animal sense that the next move needed to be made deliberately or not at all. On the 5th night, he made a decision he'd been circling for a week without quite admitting it to himself. He had always aimed. That was the entire architecture of the project, the gamer's instinct grafted onto the physicist's method. Select a target depth on TUNER's dial, tune the coherence protocol to the corresponding resonant band, and let the antenna find the nearest genetic match within that narrow slice of the past. Aiming was safety, aiming was control. It was also, he had begun to suspect, the thing keeping him shallow. Because the antenna, left to itself, did not seem to want to stay shallow. Every session he'd logged that winter, without exception, had drifted very slightly deeper than he'd dialed for a decade here, a generation there, small consistent overshoots that he'd been correcting for in his targeting without ever asking himself why the correction was necessary. As if the connection had a current in it, a gradient it wanted to fall along, and his aiming was the only thing holding it against the grain. He wondered, sitting on his floor with the copper plate cold against his palm, what would happen if he simply let go of the wheel. It was, by any reasonable scientific standard, the single worst-controlled experiment he had run since October. He had no target. He had no way to verify a location or era in advance, no host activity to time against a known duration before he was already inside it, no safety line beyond his own interested faith that the falling sensation, when it came, would eventually stop somewhere he could survive. He thought of Cathal's uncle pointing at the comet. He thought of the ratio curve, steepening without any sign of a floor. He thought, with a small, unwelcome twist of guilt, of his mother, 3,000 miles away, who thought her son was working too hard on a physics degree, and had no idea he was about to hand the steering wheel of his own consciousness to something he could not name and did not understand. He did it anyway. He dropped into theta the way he had 100 times now, 4 minutes to onset, faster than he would have believed possible in October. And when the pull came, the familiar sideways tilt of the world beginning to slide, he did not lean the connection toward any target at all. He simply stopped resisting the current he'd spent 3 months correcting against. The floor did not tilt this time, it fell away. There was no gradual descent, no sensation of passing through recognizable centuries on the way down the way. A diver passes through visible strata of colder water. There was a single, vertiginous drop, the specific, stomach-lurching absence of a floor beneath a floor beneath a floor, and Duncan MacRae, self-declared observer, careful documenter of 160 logged sessions, understood in the instant before it happened that he had no idea how far this was going to take him, and that some part of him, the part that had spent 4,000 hours in Aldermere chasing exactly this feeling in miniature, did not want it to stop. Then the fall ended, all at once, the way a lift stops. And Duncan was standing. He knew immediately that something fundamental had changed about the shape of the connection, because he was not looking out through borrowed eyes the way he'd learned to expect. He was simply there, present, upright, breathing air that smelled of green growing things and something else beneath it, mineral and faintly ozonic, like the air after a lightning strike that had never come. The sensation of a host's body around his awareness was still present. He understood dimly, somewhere at the edges of his attention. A tall frame, a stance he didn't recognize as his own. But the seam between himself and the host had gone so thin, so nearly seamless, that for one full, disorienting breath he could not locate where he ended and his host began. Then his vision cleared, and none of that mattered anymore, because of what he was looking at. He stood on a terrace of pale stone, high up, high enough that a river valley opened out below him in a long green sweep that had no business being green, no business being anything but the flat ochre desert he had flown over on a connecting flight to Cairo 2 summers ago on a conference layover. The valley was lush. Not tropical, not jungle, but a rich temperate green, threaded by a wide silver river that caught the light and threw it back in long unbroken sheets. Its banks worked into terraces of cultivation that ran for miles in geometric perfection, curve after curve after curve, as if the land itself had been tuned like an instrument rather than farmed. And rising out of that valley, catching a sun that hung low and gold in a sky the color of beaten copper, were the shapes that made Duncan's breath, his host's breath, his own breath, he genuinely could not tell stop in his chest. They were pyramids. He recognized the geometry immediately, some deep animal part of his brain reaching for the only vocabulary it had. But they were not the weathered, sand-blasted, monumental ruins he had walked around at Giza with a guidebook in his hand, humbled the way every tourist was humbled. These were whole. Smooth-faced, white gold, catching the low sun and throwing it back in sheets of clean, hard brilliance, their surfaces unmarked by thousands of years of erosion because they gleamed like they had been finished yesterday. Their proportions were subtly, unsettlingly wrong compared to the shapes burned into his memory from every documentary he'd half-watched as a boy, steeper, taller. The angles carrying a mathematical confidence that made the Giza Plateau he knew feel, in retrospect, like a schoolboy's careful copy of a master's original. Between the pyramids and the terrace where he stood, structures he had no names for at all rose out of the valley floor in curved, organic lines, not built. His host's own unbidden knowledge whispered at the edge of his awareness, not built the way a mason builds, but grown, shaped the way a pearl is shaped, layer upon layer coaxed into form by something Duncan's borrowed senses understood, without words, as sound. He felt, distantly, an echo of the crannog, Cathal's palm against the timber pile, listening for the honest tone of stone beneath water, and understood with a cold, cascading vertigo that he was looking at the same principle scaled up by some factor his mind refused, for several long seconds, to actually calculate. Overhead, impossibly, something moved without wings and without sound, a long pale shape tracking low across the gold sky on a course that curved gently toward the pyramids and did not fall. Duncan's host lifted a hand, not Duncan's intention, not a whisper, not a nudge, simply the host's own unremarkable gesture, shading eyes against the sun to track the shape overhead. And in the periphery of that raised hand, in the polished pale stone of the terrace railing beside him, Duncan caught, for less than a second, a reflection. A tall frame. A face longer and finer-boned than any human face he'd stood behind so far, the skull rising higher above the brow than any skull had rights to. And hair, unmistakably, catching the low gold light exactly the way his own hair caught morning light in his bathroom mirror 300 centuries and one dying breath of a fall away. Copper red. Duncan MacRae, physicist, gamer, passenger inside a body that was not his own standing on a terrace above a valley that history had no record of, felt the ground of every assumption he had built this entire project on quietly, comprehensively, give way. This isn't the beginning of anything, he thought, and the thought arrived in a silence so total it felt less like a realization than a diagnosis. This is what comes after something enormous. This is the part nobody remembered to tell. Somewhere very far above him, 30,000 years and 40 objective seconds away, a kitchen timer he had forgotten to set was not going to save him. Chapter 5, The Resonant Field. Something had changed dramatically. Until now, he had been a passenger strapped into a seat behind the driver's eyes, watching the road unfold. But here, in this lush, pre-desert valley, the signal wasn't just stronger, it was cleaner. The noise floor of history had dropped away. He stood on the terrace for a moment longer, watching the wingless barge slip silently toward the pyramid's apex, and then he felt an attraction. It wasn't the jarring tilt of a new session, it was simply a tuning. There was suddenly another stronger signal nearby. As the crowd thickened on the causeway, Duncan felt a magnetic pull to his left. His awareness was sliding, unbidden, toward a pair of striking figures walking in the center of a promenade, surrounded by attendants and guards. They moved differently than the others. There was no effort in their step, no friction between intention and motion. Crowds parted silently like water moved by the bow of a boat. They were in phase with the ground they walked on. Switch, Duncan thought. Resisting the pull of this new signal was unthinkable. So he let go. The transition was seamless. One step he was looking at the back of the tall man's tunic. The next, he was looking out through eyes that saw the world in layers. He was Neath. The change wasn't disorienting, it was clarifying. The visual spectrum expanded. He could see the heat signatures of the crowd, not as infrared, but as auras of activity, blue for calm labor, orange for exertion, red for friction. He could sense the hum of the pyramid not as a sound, but as a pressure against his skin. And he could feel the ground. He looked down at his host's delicate hands. They were long-fingered, slender, yet capable. He looked further, taking in the body he now inhabited. Neath was tall, exceptionally so. Duncan estimated 6 feet 4 inches, towering over the attendants. Her build was lean, almost willowy, but beneath the linen robes, he could feel a density of muscle that suggested explosive power held in reserve. Her head felt larger than any human host he'd occupied before, the cranium spacious, accommodating a brain that processed data at a rate that made his own Stanford-era cognition feel like abacus math. He looked down at his feet. He was wearing sandals, but they were not simple leather. The soles were woven with fine filaments of copper, interlaced with the fiber in a geometric pattern that matched the antenna geometry he had found in his own DNA as his foot struck the causeway. He felt a circuit close. A tiny discharge, harmless but perceptible, flowed from his body into the stone. Grounding, Duncan analyzed, the scientist in him marveling even as the host walked. Static dissipation, or phase locking. It made sense. If you were manipulating electromagnetic fields with your mind, you needed a reference point. You couldn't float untethered. The copper in the sandals grounded them to the Earth's own telluric current, stabilizing the biofield so it wouldn't drift into chaos. It was a safety circuit woven into footwear. He walked beside Ton. The man was even larger, perhaps 7 feet tall, a titan of lean elegance. His head was similarly proportioned, the brow high, the features sharp and clean, and thick, meticulously styled copper-colored hair. Without explanation, Duncan intuitively knew they were the offspring of 2 lines, the Earth royalty and the pioneer stock from another world. He sensed it in the thoughts of the silent passersby. Clearly, their origin story had become myth. The society's henna-colored hair was a testimony to the esteem copper-colored hair conveyed. Duncan intuitively understood that Neith herself had no true understanding of her origins. Yet Duncan could feel the hybrid genetics in the way the host cells hummed, a dual helix stability that ordinary humans lacked. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Duncan could feel Ton's state as clearly as he could feel his own heartbeat. Calm, focused, ready. The city around them was alive, but not in the way a modern city was alive. There was no roar of engines, no shout of commerce. The silence was profound, broken only by the hum of work. Duncan watched a group of workers to their right. 12 of them surrounding a block of stone that hovered at waist height. They weren't straining. They were walking in step, their headgear pulsing with a soft, rhythmic light. To them, this was mundane. Duncan felt the host's indifference to the miracle. It was like watching someone use a door handle. You don't marvel at the latch every time you enter a room. Bootstrap technology, Duncan thought. They aren't building a civilization. They are gardening it. The architecture flowed around them. Walls curved without angles, grown rather than stacked. Light emanated from strips of crystal embedded in the stone, glowing with a soft, shadowless luminescence. There were no wires, no pipes. Water flowed in open channels, defying gravity in gentle spirals, pushed by acoustic fields too low for Duncan's ears to catch, but which he could feel vibrating. It was beautiful and somewhat terrifying. They reached the base of the pyramid. Duncan was overwhelmed. In his time, the Great Pyramid was a weathered stump, its casing stones stolen, its capstone lost, a monument to decay. Here it was a monument of light. The outer casing was polished white limestone, seamless and mirror-smooth, reflecting the sun's blinding brilliance. It wasn't a building. It was a single, continuous crystal interface. And at the apex, the Benben stone, the capstone, was electrum, a polished gold-silver alloy that caught the sunlight and threw it back in a beam visible for miles. It was flawless. It was finished. It was operational. The structure loomed above them, not as a monument, but as a machine. The white gold casing vibrated with a frequency that would have made Duncan's teeth ache. The entrance was not a hole in the stone, it was a membrane. A shimmering field of distortion stretched across the opening, invisible to the untrained eye, but blazing like a neon sign to Neith's vision. Security, Duncan thought. Neith stepped forward. Ton matched her pace. As they crossed the threshold, Duncan felt the field wash over them. It wasn't a barrier, it was a scanner. It read the genetic signature, the resonant frequency of the crystal on their brows, the copper in their sandals. Access granted. The pressure vanished. They were inside. The interior chamber was vast, circular, lined with the same crystalline lattice as the outer shell. In the center, a column of pure energy rose from the floor to the ceiling, silent and blindingly white. It wasn't fire. It wasn't electricity. It was something older, something fundamental. The source, Neith thought, the word carried a spiritual weight. It was a manifestation of the origin point, the One. Neith moved to one of the raised platforms opposite Ton. She sat cross-legged, her spine straight, her hands resting on her knees. Ton mirrored her. They were alone in the chamber, but Duncan knew this was a procedure, a maintenance cycle. 3 hours, Neith thought, or the decay sets in. Duncan understood instantly. The enhancement was unstable. To live at this level of sensitivity, to manipulate matter with mind, required constant calibration. Without the pyramid's field, their own biology would begin to suffer phase cancellation. Their cells would vibrate out of sync. Their world would deteriorate. They activated the headgear. The crystal on Neith's brow flared. Duncan felt the connection snap into place, not with the pyramid but with Ton. They were forming a closed loop, a circuit. The energy column in the center pulsed. A wave of soundless vibration washed over them. Duncan screamed internally, not in pain, but in overload. His consciousness, trained on EEG traces and Fourier transforms, was suddenly drowning in raw data. He could see the resonance of the air molecules. He could see the spin of electrons in the crystal lattice. He could see the history of the stone beneath them, the memory of its formation encoded in its vibrational state. It was mind-blowing, it was terrifying. He looked down at his host's delicate hands. They were translucent, not literally, but perceptually. He could see the energy flowing through the meridians, the bioelectric current syncing with the room's field. He realized that the one they worshipped was the source of this field. The unified field theory made manifest. The pyramid was a temple and a tuning fork for the planet. Steady, Neith thought, her mind acting as a grounding wire for Duncan's panic. Do not resist the tune. Duncan forced himself to stop analyzing and start receiving. He let the noise floor drop. He let the signal pass through. As the minutes ticked by, objective time meaningless here, Duncan realized something else. The workers outside, the groups of 9 and 12, they weren't just building a civilization. They were maintaining a standing wave. Every block lifted, every channel of water directed, was a note in a song that kept the reality stable. And he saw the danger, not from outside, from within. He looked at Tan. He didn't see a face, he saw a spectrum. A halo of color surrounding the man's form, shifting in real time. Blue for calm, gold for focus. But beneath that, Duncan saw threads of intent. When Tan thought of Neith, the threads smoothed out, becoming laminar flow. When he thought of the council, they jagged slightly, friction. Truth is geometry, Duncan realized, the insight hitting him like a physical blow. Deception is noise. In this room, you couldn't lie. If Tan had said I am calm while feeling fear, the dissonance would have been visible, a static burst in the field, a tear in the color. The intrigue of Duncan's world, the political maneuvering, the hidden agendas, the social masking, was impossible here. Frequency was perceptible. To plot against someone was to broadcast your weapon before you drew it. The low intrigue of this society wasn't moral, it was physical. You couldn't hide the signal. Then he saw it, a flicker in Tan's spectrum, a tiny shard of red amidst the gold. Ambition, not for power over others, but a desire for more power. A desire to hold more of the charge than his vessel could safely contain. Duncan felt Neith sense it too. She didn't speak, she didn't accuse. She simply adjusted her own frequency, a subtle shift in phase that canceled out the discord. A correction. Silent, invisible to anyone who couldn't see the spectrum. But Tan saw it too. Duncan felt the man's awareness snap to the flaw in his own field. There was no shame, no denial, there was only adjustment. Tan breathed out, long and slow, and the red shard dissolved. The field smoothed. The ambition was vented, released into the ground through the copper in his sandals. Correction complete, Tan thought. Duncan sat in the silence of the recharge, feeling the hum of the pyramid vibrate through his bones. He realized with a cold, cascading vertigo that this was an upside-down world compared to the future he came from. In Duncan's world, truth was hidden. You needed lawyers, investigators, forensics to find it. Lies were easy. They cost nothing. Privacy was a wall you built to keep people out. Here, truth was physical. It was visible. Lies were painful. They disrupted the field. Privacy wasn't a wall, it was a transparency you maintained for the sake of the whole. You couldn't hide the signal. This is the lurk, Duncan thought, the realization settling over him like the cold water of the loch had centuries ago. This is the danger. The technology was perfect. The society was harmonious. The truth was visible. But the ego was a variable that couldn't be fully engineered out. It hid in the harmonics. It waited for the moment the recharge ended, when they stepped back out into the world of stone and shadow, where the signal was weaker and the lies could breathe again. Tan had corrected himself, but the red shard had been there. It had existed, and if it existed once, it could exist again. This world resonated at a much higher level, but human nature was the variable that couldn't be calibrated out. The column pulsed brighter. The recharge was complete. Neith opened her eyes. The spectrum faded, returning to normal vision, stone, light, husband. But Duncan recognized the precarious state of the world he had left, where every person he had ever met was screaming with noise they couldn't hear, living in a world of static they mistook for silence. He stood with Neith, he walked with Tan, he stepped back out into the sunlight. And for the first time, Duncan MacRae didn't want to go home, he wanted to stay. This wasn't just history, this was the endgame. Chapter 6, The Cold Phase. The transition didn't have the soft, rolling tilt of his previous drops, nor the deep, stomach-lurching plunge that had brought him to Neath's terrace. It was a sheer. One instant he was stepping out of the pyramid's resonance chamber beside Neath, his awareness steeped in the warm, living harmonics of the white limestone machine. The next, the field fractured. The physical sensation of Neath's long-limbed grace tore away like dry paper, replaced by an absolute, suffocating void that lasted for less than a heartbeat. And then he collapsed into a space so radically silent it felt like a physical weight pressing against his ears. He wasn't floating. He was standing, though he had no sensation of feet. "Look down," a voice said. The voice didn't travel through air. It arrived in his mind as a sequence of clean, low-latency data packets, sharp, clear, and utterly devoid of the spatial reverbs he'd grown used to in Neath's world. Duncan looked down. He saw a torso, arms, legs, dressed in a faded Stanford Consciousness Studies hoodie, dark jeans, and worn running shoes. He raised his hands. They were his hands, not the broad, net-scarred hands of the Orkney fisherman, not the delicate, copper-filamented hands of Neath. His hands. The knuckles he'd scraped on his bike last spring. The pale skin of a guy who spent 16 hours a day in a Palo Alto basement. "A local construct," the voice continued, smooth and dry, "synthesized from your active self-conception. It minimizes cognitive dissonance during non-local interaction. You may consider it a high-density projection." Duncan looked up. He was standing in a vast, vaulted chamber that looked less like a ship's bridge and more like the interior of a hollowed-out nickel-iron asteroid. The walls were dark, brushed metallic plates laced with geometric conduits that glowed with a faint, violet light. There were no windows, but a massive three-dimensional volumetric projection hung in the center of the room, a sweeping view of a pale blue sphere, flanked by a barren gray satellite, and trailing behind, a cluster of 7 massive, needle-shaped vessels. Standing around the projection platform were 3 figures. Duncan took an involuntary step back. He had thought Neath and Ton were tall. These beings were something else entirely. They stood nearly 8 feet tall, their bodies so long and hyper-attenuated that they looked like line drawings brought into terrifying three-dimensional reality. Their torsos were short, their ribs prominent beneath seamless, slate-gray pressure suits. Their necks were long, supporting heads with massive, high-domed craniums, macrocephalic skulls that sloped dramatically upward above deep-set, obsidian eyes. And cascading down their narrow shoulders were thick, brilliant shocks of deep copper hair. The intelligence radiating from them wasn't a warm, ambient field like the pyramids. It was razor-sharp, cold, and blindingly fast. Standing in their presence felt like placing a hand on an uninsulated high-voltage wire. "You are overwhelmed," the figure in the center remarked. Her voice carried no pity, only flat observation. She stepped forward, her motions agonizingly slow, calculated to avoid tearing her delicate musculature in whatever simulated gravity field held the ship. "I am Vale, flight director for the 3rd Reclamation Fleet." Duncan swallowed, his projected throat dry. When am I?" "You are currently locked into a quantum-entangled consciousness bridge with the flagship Ethel," Vale said, gesturing toward the volumetric map. "In physical space, our fleet is 62 days from Earth orbital insertion, decelerating from a high-velocity transit from Mars." Duncan stared at the blue sphere and the hologram. 62 days, but I was just in Egypt. I was with Neath. In the Nile Valley. "You were in what your degraded history calls the Golden Age," Vale interrupted smoothly. "Specifically, you were observing the Nile Basin in the year 23,411 before your Common Era." Duncan blinked. 23,000 BCE. "And where are we now?" Duncan asked, his voice shaking slightly. "Relative to her." "We are in the year 49,802 before your Common Era," Vale replied. The number hit Duncan like a physical blow. He staggered, his projected knees catching on a floor that wasn't really there. 50,000 years ago," he whispered, "I went. I jumped 25,000 years backward." "Time is a spatial dimension in the quantum substrate of the genome," the figure to Vale's left said. A male, his face a severe, geometric mask of pale skin and hard bone. "Distance is irrelevant to the antenna. You did not jump. You were summoned." "This is Kalen, chief architect," Vale said, nodding to the male. And to my right is Oren, representative of the surface settlement faction. Oren stepped forward, his dark eyes fixated on Duncan with an intensity that made Duncan's simulated skin prickle. He is small, Oren noted, his mental broadcast carrying a sharp edge of irritation. His neural capacity is severely bottlenecked. You expect this. This primitive to mediate our return. His neural architecture is degraded, yes, Vale replied coldly, not turning her head. Because he is the product of 50 millennia of genetic drift, atmospheric compression, and radiological decay. But he possesses the precise fractal sequence required to anchor our broadcast across the temporal well. He is our only bridge. Bridge for what? Duncan demanded, forcing himself to stand tall, relying on the hard-won muscle memory of a guy who had spent years arguing statistical models in Stanford seminars. What do you want from me? Vale brought up a second volumetric display. It showed Mars, not the red, dead rock of Duncan's 21st century, but a scarred, dying world wrapped in a thinning atmosphere, its surface pitted with massive industrial scars and collapsing artificial domes. Our home is dead, Vale said simply. A runaway magnetospheric collapse compounded by systemic orbital resource depletion. We are the last 300,000 survivors of the Martian human branch. We have been in transit for 2 years. We are coming home to Earth. Immediately, Oren interjected, his voice slicing through the space. We have the technology to reshape the planet. We have the acoustic manipulation grids, the atmospheric scrubbers, the seed vaults. The native hominids on Earth are primitive, hunter-gatherers huddling in caves. We will descend, establish the resonance towers, and claim our birthright. And you will die within 3 generations, Duncan said. The chamber went dead silent. Oren's eyes narrowed into slits of pure dark glass. What did you say, primitive? Duncan took a breath. The intimidation was still there. The sheer terrifying scale of their intellects made his brain feel like an old dial-up modem trying to process a fiber optic stream. But he was a physicist, and physics didn't care about macrocephalic skulls or high-density consciousness. I've seen your descendants, Duncan said, looking squarely at Oren. I just came from 23,000 BC. I was inside Neath. I saw what you become. Vale leaned forward slightly, her interest piqued. Elaborate. You're tall, you're frail, and your bones are built for 1/3 Earth gravity, Duncan said, gesturing at their extended limbs. If you drop 300,000 low-gravity Martians directly onto Earth's surface, the Earth's gravity well will crush you. Your cardiovascular systems will fail. Your bone density will collapse. You think you're going to land and build an empire, but within a few generations, you'll become a brittle, desperate ruling caste. A tiny elite sitting in white pyramids, using resonance tech as a crutch just to keep your own cells from vibrating apart in a gravity field that's suffocating you. Oren's face flushed a dark violet hue. Nonsense. Our biological regulation. I saw the calibration chamber, Duncan shouted, his voice echoing in the metallic vault. I saw Neath and Tan sitting in the Great Pyramid, running 3-hour daily recharge protocols just to prevent cellular phase cancellation. They don't even know why they do it anymore. It's become a religious ritual. They've lost the theory. They're practicing technique without understanding. They're a hybrid caste, ethically brittle, trapped in a dying golden age that ends in a catastrophic flood. Vale and Kalen exchanged a long, silent look. A rapid burst of high-frequency data transmission that passed between them in a flash of shifting, light in their eyes. Oren looked shaken. A flood. The younger Dryas cataclysm, Duncan said softly. It's coming 20,000 years after you land. And because you dropped straight to the surface and forced a hybrid civilization without fixing your biology, you won't be strong enough to survive it when the ice melts. You will be wiped out, leaving behind nothing but out-of-place artifacts, massive stone blocks nobody knows how to move, and broken myths about gods who came from the sky. Kalen, the chief architect, stepped forward. He is correct about the gravitational load, he admitted softly, his voice a low hum. Our models predicted a 42% physiological degradation within 4 generations of atmospheric entry. Oren's factions suppressed the data to prevent panic during the transit. It was an acceptable risk, Oren snapped. The alternative is remaining in 0G until our life support systems fail. No, Duncan said, looking at the hologram of the Earth-Moon system. There's a middle ground, you're looking right at it. He reached out his projected hand and touched the gray, cratered marble floating beside the Earth. Chapter 7, The Lunar Anchor. Duncan expanded the lunar hologram. His hands moved intuitively through the interface, his background in game design and structural modeling taking over as he manipulated the volumetric display. The moon, Duncan said. Oren sneered, a airless dust ball, a dead rock. A dead rock with 1/6 Earth gravity, Duncan countered, which is a manageable step down from Mars, but infinitely safer than plunging headfirst into Earth's 1G envelope. Look at the lunar South Pole, Shackleton Crater. Deep lava tubes beneath the surface. Perfect radiation shielding, vast deposits of water ice, and structural stability. Kalen stepped closer, his obsidian eyes scanning the data stream Duncan was pulling up. Subterranean polar colonization. We used similar architecture in the Martian Hellas Basin. Exactly, Duncan said, leaning into the physics. You build an underground polar staging ground on the moon. You don't invade Earth, you set up a sanctuary. From the lunar base, you run short-stay scout missions down to Earth. You establish non-invasive resource lifelines. You begin long-term, multi-generational adaptation programs, gradually reacclimating your genetics to 1G through rotation rings and controlled bioengineering, rather than dumping your entire population into a gravity well that will mutate and crush you. And the native Earth populations, Vale asked quietly. You uplift them slowly, Duncan said. You don't play God. You don't build a fragile, top-heavy caste system where you're the golden giants in the sky. You teach them. You plant the foundational knowledge. You integrate. Silence fell over the bridge again. Oren looked at the lunar projection, his posture stiff, but the hostility in his aura had begun to give way to something far more dangerous to his argument: calculation. It extends our timeline to full terrestrial integration by 6 centuries, Kalen observed, running a rapid simulation on his wrist console. But structural survivability increases by 800%. System integrity remains green. It saves your people, Duncan said. Real survival, not a slow, beautiful extinction. Vale walked up to Duncan's holographic form. Standing this close, she towered over him, but her expression had changed. The cold, analytical detachment had softened into something resembling profound, ancient reverence. You speak as if you are trying to change our minds, Vale said softly. Duncan frowned. I am trying to change your minds. I'm telling you what happens if you land in Egypt. Duncan, Vale said, and hearing his name pronounced by a Martian who lived 50,000 years before his birth sent a shiver down his spine. Why do you think we built the Genesis antenna? Duncan froze. What? Why do you think your DNA carries the fractal log periodic repeat sequences flanking the MC1R locus? Vale asked, her voice echoing with a haunting, multi-layered resonance. Why do you think Tuner worked on a board Friday night in Palo Alto? Duncan felt the floor slide beneath him, not a temporal drop, but the sudden, terrifying realization of a man stepping onto a mirror. We didn't broadcast into the future at random, Kalen explained gently. 2 months ago, as our fleet reached the outer edge of the Sol system, our long-range consciousness arrays detected a timeline fracture. A degraded reality. A timeline where a desperate Martian fleet landed directly on Earth, created a short-lived, brittle hybrid civilization in 25,000 BC, and was subsequently wiped out by the cataclysm, leaving Earth's humanity broken, amnesiac, and alone. Vale reached out, her long, slender finger passing through the edge of Duncan's holographic shoulder. We searched that degraded timeline for a signal, she whispered. We looked for the one genetic node capable of receiving us, someone who possessed both the ancient Martian receiver DNA and the theoretical physics framework to understand what he was seeing. We found you, Duncan. Duncan's breath caught in his throat. You pulled me here. We summoned you to give us the solution, Vale said. We couldn't see the path from inside our own desperation. We were blind, grieving, and terrified. We needed someone from the end of the line, someone who had walked the ruins of our mistakes, to tell us where to build the bridge. The Egyptians you saw, Neith, Ton, the White Pyramids, they were the remnants of the broken timeline, Kaelin added. The timeline where we didn't listen. But by bringing you here, by choosing the moon, we erase that mistake. We heal the track. Duncan looked back and forth between the three Martians. The bootstrap, he breathed. The gamer was always the game. Orin, Vale said, turning to the surface faction leader. Recalibrate the fleet's insertion vector. Target, lunar South Pole, Shackleton Crater. Prepare the subterranean construction units. Orin stared at the lunar hologram for a long moment. Then, slowly, he bowed his head, a deep, fluid gesture of acquiescence. Vector recalibrated. The moon shall be our stepping stone. Vale turned back to Duncan. The violet lights along the bridge walls began to pulse, vibrating in harmony with a deep, distant hum rising from the ship's drive core. Your work here is complete, Duncan MacRae, Vale said. The fleet has chosen its course. The loop is closed. Wait, Duncan said, reaching out a hand as his holographic form began to blur, pixelating into streams of pure light. What happens to my world? What happens when I go back? You will wake up in the world you built, Vale replied, her voice fading into a warm, melodic whisper that echoed through his bloodline. A world that was never broken, a world that remembers. The bridge of the Ethel shattered into a million points of gold light. The cold vacuum of space, the macrocephalic Martians, the three-dimensional lunar maps, all of it dissolved into a single, blinding frequency that surged up through the copper plate at the base of his skull. Duncan fell. Not down through centuries, not sideways through time, but up, snapping backward like a stretched rubber band released after 50,000 years of tension. He gasped, his lungs inflating with dusty, lukewarm Palo Alto air. He was sitting on his foam mat. The red glow of his dimmed laptop monitor washed over his hands. The kitchen timer on his desk was ticking softly. Objective time elapsed, 14 minutes. Duncan sat frozen, the copper induction plate burning hot against his neck. He slowly pulled off the EEG cap, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped it. He turned to his computer. The spreadsheet was still open on the screen. He opened a web browser. He didn't search for physics papers, or historical catalogs, or Han Dynasty comets. With trembling fingers, he typed a simple query into the search bar. Lunar South Pole Colony. The page loaded instantly. The Shackleton Polar Sanctuary, established during the first integration era, announced today that public tour of the historic underground vaults, built by the original Martian settlers in 49,000 BCE, will open next month. Duncan MacRae leaned back in his chair, covered his face with his hands, and began to laugh. Epilogue, the landing. Duncan didn't step out of his apartment, building so much, as he fell out of reality. The hallway of the Consciousness Studies Annex was gone. The faded drywall, the faint smell of floor wax and stale coffee, the fluorescent lights that hummed at a lazy 60 hertz, erased as if they had never been painted into existence in the first place. He found himself standing on a wide, sweeping promenade of translucent, pale green stone that felt warm even through the soles of his running shoes. Above him, the sky wasn't the pale, hazy blue of 21st century Palo Alto. It was an impossible, crystalline azure, threaded with shimmering, iridescent ribbons of light that curved toward the horizon. High-altitude magnetic conduits, silent and motionless, carrying silent transport craft along the contours of the magnetosphere. The sound hit him next, or rather the absence of it. There were no combustion engines, no distant rumble of the 101 freeway. No sirens, no jet contrails, no white noise of millions of friction-driven machines. Instead, the city sang. The towering, grown crystal spires that spiraled thousands of feet into the air vibrated with a soft, harmonic resonance. A living, planetary standing wave that Duncan felt in his teeth, his chest, the very marrow of his bones. People moved around him, thousands of them. They walked with an effortless, fluid grace, clad in seamless fabrics that shifted color with their moods. But it was their faces that sent a cold spike of panic straight through Duncan's heart. They were tall, Even the shortest among them towered over his 6-foot frame. Their skulls sloped back smoothly, high-domed and spacious, and their eyes carried a depth of perception that felt like looking into deep water. When they passed one another, their lips didn't move. Their expressions changed in subtle, rapid microflickers, a dialogue of pure, unvoiced geometry happening in the space between them. He tried to read a sign on a nearby pillar. The glyphs were fluid, three-dimensional light structures that shifted as he moved, displaying math, concept, and tone all at once. He couldn't read a single character. He couldn't even parse the grammar. Marty McFly on steroids, his brain supplied, reaching desperately for a pop culture reference to anchor his sanity. But this wasn't Back to the Future. This wasn't a world with flying cars and hoverboards. This was 50,000 years of uninterrupted, highly integrated, human-Martian evolutionary synthesis. He had healed the timeline, he had saved the fleet, he had given them the moon. And in doing so, he had utterly erased his own species. The Palo Alto he knew, the messy, flawed, noisy, beautiful world of Stanford seminars, cheap coffee, bad jokes about Picts, and 4,000 hours of Aldermere, didn't exist. It had never existed. He was a ghost from a degraded, phantom timeline that had been scrubbed clean from the universe. A wave of crushing, suffocating dread hit him like a physical blow. His knees buckled. He stumbled off the glowing promenade onto a patch of brilliant, violet-tinted moss in a surrounding park, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. He clutched his Stanford hoodie, the only piece of the dead world left on Earth, and squeezed his eyes shut. He was entirely, mathematically, irreversibly alone. "It is a lot to absorb all at once," a voice said. The voice didn't come from the air. It arrived in his mind, not as the cold data stream of Vale's bridge, nor as the raw, overwhelming surge of the pyramid, but as a clean, warm, perfectly modulated thought. Duncan forced his eyes open. Standing on the violet moss a few feet away was a young woman. She was tall, nearly 6'6", dressed in a simple, flowing tunic of copper-threaded linen. Her skull carried the long, elegant curve of the integrated bloodline, but her face was remarkably human, her eyes bright and filled with a gentle, unmistakable warmth. And her hair, falling in thick waves over her shoulders, was a brilliant, fiery copper red. She smiled down at him, a genuine, radiant smile that cut right through the icy knot of terror in his chest. Duncan MacRae, her mental voice projected, soft and soothing as a warm tide. "Breathe, you are safe. Your heart rate is dangerously elevated. Allow the Parks field to assist you." Duncan swallowed hard, forcing himself to look up at her. You know who I am." "Everyone knows the anchor," she replied silently, her eyes dancing with quiet humor. "Though we did not expect your physical vessel to materialize quite so, dramatically in the middle of the San Francisco Sol Plaza." "I don't belong here," Duncan choked out, his voice sounding rasping and primitive against the quiet song of the city. I can't read the signs, I don't know the language. My world is gone." The woman's smile softened into deep empathy. She knelt beside him on the moss, bringing herself down to his eye level. She didn't touch him, respecting his boundary, but the warmth of her biofield radiated against his cold skin. "Your world was a broken shadow, Duncan," she sent gently. "A dark timeline where our ancestors died in the mud and yours forgot the stars. You didn't destroy your world. You gave humanity its true birthright." She gestured toward the sweeping vista of crystal spires, the silent transport ribbons, and the pale, visible crescent of the moon hanging in the afternoon sky, where the gleaming lights of the subterranean Shackleton metropolis shone clearly on the lunar limb. Vale and the Fleet Council knew the shock of returning to the healed timeline would be absolute for you, the woman continued, her mind speech wrapping around his thoughts like a comforting blanket. "The temporal displacement of a complete timeline overwrite is too vast for a single mind to hold without a guide. That is why I was sent." Duncan blinked, wiping a bead of cold sweat from his forehead. "Sent? Who are you?" "My name is Mara," she said. "I am a historian of the first integration, and I am here to show you the world you helped build." She stood up slowly, offering him a long-fingered, slender hand woven with fine copper threads at the wrist. "We will take all the time you need," Mara added, her tone light and encouraging. "We will walk the earth." We will visit the Lunar Polar Sanctuary. We will teach you the language of the resonance, show you the gardens, and let you see what 50,000 years of peace looks like." Duncan looked at her hand. Then he looked at the distant, shining moon. The dread in his chest didn't vanish. It was still a heavy, terrifying weight, but beneath it, a tiny ember of his old, relentless curiosity flared back to life. The gamer, the physicist, the explorer who couldn't stop asking, "How far back can I go?" He took her hand. Her grip was warm, solid, and impossibly strong. She pulled him up effortlessly. "And after the tour?" Duncan asked, his voice steadying slightly. "What happens to me then? I'm a man out of time." "I don't have a role here." Mara's smile broadened, her obsidian eyes flashing with brilliant light. She leaned in slightly, and a thought passed from her mind to his, a crisp, formal message embedded with the official seal of the High Council of the Two Worlds. "When we are done with the tour," Mara communicated, her voice ringing clear and triumphant in his mind, "you are invited to return to the fleet. As our official plenipotentiary and liaison to Earth in the year 49,802 before Common Era." Duncan stared at her, stunned. "Liaison to 50,000 BC. The Martians are establishing the Shackleton base," Mara explained, her mind humming with excitement. "They are scared, long-lived, and desperately in need of someone who understands both the cold math of their physics and the warm, stubborn heart of terrestrial humanity. They asked for you by name. Vale said she wouldn't build the future without the man who pointed them to the moon." Duncan looked down at his faded Stanford hoodie, then out at the shining, healed Earth, and finally up at the blue sky where a fleet of starships had once decelerated toward a dead rock. He let out a long, slow breath, a faint smile finally tugging at the corner of his lips. "Well," Duncan MacRae said, pulling his hood up over his bright red hair, "show me the world first, then let's go back and build it."